it's one of the hardest things to understand when you're a survivor yourself is what's going on in your head and what you're feeling and why you're feeling it. I find one of the harder parts of my recovery had been, am I experiencing this emotion because of my frontal lobe issues? Am I getting irritable or angry because I'm overwhelmed or I'm tired? Or am I genuinely upset? Is this something that's genuinely affecting me? And then add hormones and your cycle into that. And, everyone has some sort of emotional dysregulation problems just by being human, by whatever you go through in life, whether, just the day by day cycles, if you're hungry, if you're tired, things like that. But when you have a brain injury, it's like everything is just amplified to the extreme. And it's so hard to regulate and understand.
I think back to what you said about not knowing, as a survivor, what is your brain injury versus what's reality versus, what's are you hungry? I always say a brain injury is the only time that we ask the injured body part to regulate itself. Any other body part, if you break your leg, it's your brain that helps regulate how much you use that leg. If you pull a muscle, it's your brain that does that. But with a brain injury, we're asking the injured body part to do the heavy lifting. And it's like, sometimes that doesn't always work. And I think that is what creates that sense of like unknown. I also have this thing that I talk about justifiable paranoia, because I think a lot of times, individuals with brain injury are in this state of kind of justifiable paranoia because you are on shaky ground. You're kind of always doing that like double check of yourself. And, is sometimes it's easy to feel like, okay, the world's kind of out to get me, because the world is changing based on what your memory is, what you're processing, all of that. So I think that, and that's why it's great, bringing up this concept of like emotional dysregulation, emotional regulation, because that is really at the heart of a lot of that. And so emotional regulation is just at the sense of that. That's our ability to control our emotions and keep in check how we emotionally respond to stimuli, to the world around us. And sometimes after a brain injury, for all of these various reasons we've talked about, that can be a little out of sync. And sometimes, you may overreact to something that, it might just be something little, but you kind of do this blow up reaction. But that may be because your brain's ability to process the information is different now because of the brain injury. And so sometimes that keeping that in check, and even starting to learn and understand the idea that our brain controls our emotional reaction to things. I think so often we think about emotions and feelings as this separate concept than actual skill sets that our brain, utilizes. And so just like any other skill set, we have an idea of like muscle control and memory as skills that our brain does. The same with controlling our emotion. That is a skill that our brain does. And so after a brain injury, that can be impacted. And just even getting that understanding and to be able to take a step back and a breath about that. I think so often we don't give survivors that opportunity to learn how the brain works and give permission to be like, it's okay for this to be a little out of whack. Take a little bit of time to recognize that.
I also feel like the emotional dysregulation is one of the hardest parts for the family, or for the people that knew the individual before their injury, because they do change so much, that emotional piece and the, so I think it's good for tips for both, so they can kind of understand what's going on and see, like, if the professional one could be even given to the family or something too, just to to help them learn how to regulate, because I think that's the scariest part sometimes for the family and their friends and things.
Yeah, very well said. I agree. And as a survivor myself, I find that emotions is one of the parts of brain injury recovery that impacts every moment and every day. So let's say I've gone to physical therapy or occupational therapy and I have exercises that are going to help me cognitively. If my emotions are out of whack and I'm irritable, I'm depressed, I'm not going to be motivated to do those things because I'm going to spiral down that hole of being like, it's never going to get better. And then, I'm going to get upset and angry. And then I might go to eat foods that make my brain worse, like sugar and stuff that is not helping my brain recovery. And I might go to unhealthy habits and go on my phone and consume social media nonstop. And this kind of stuff is hard for anyone to manage mental health wise, especially I think in the last year with the pandemic. But even so, when you have a brain injury, it's like every stimuli affects your brain more because it's hurting and it's struggling. And I appreciate what you said, Rebecca, about how brain injury is the only time you ask the injured part of the body to fix itself or regulate itself or do whatever. I think that's really important. So I want to ask you, what are some signs or tells that are things that people could learn to look for when it comes to emotions?
Yeah. So saying or doing things often without thinking. A lot of times, an individual might be the not knowing, or if you have emotional outbursts and things, and then afterwards you don't know why. That's a really common one of, if, asking somebody, or if somebody asks you after something, why did you do that? When I don't know. I just did. I don't know. That's really a sign that it wasn't a cognitive choice for you to be behaving that way. That emotion wasn't a cognitive choice. It was more just related to this, dysregulation within your body. One of the things that you'd mentioned was, consuming social media without stopping, and those pieces. A lot of times, difficulty knowing when to stop an activity, that inability to kind of put in place those natural starts and stops that we do throughout our lives. So it can lead to individuals, becoming obsessed with like social media, as you said. That's one that even individuals without brain injuries are having a really hard time with these days. But I mean, my daughter's introduced me to TikTok, and I think that was like one of the worst things. After like 2 weeks was like, I have to uninstall this. Like, this is not healthy for me. But so the inability to kind of recognize that. And then often when, one of the things that can happen there is if somebody does interrupt you or want you to stop and pull away, that, kind of an anger outburst about having to stop an activity or getting frustrated and inability to do that. Doing things quickly, without safety, regard to safety, not taking that time to stop and think. Kind of having an outburst or responding with, immediate knee jerk of, if you're angry or frustrated with somebody, and just responding without taking that moment to stop and think. And, that whole thing of like count to 10 and that stuff, that inability to do that. Having rapidly shifting moods. So moods that kind of go from, really elated to then really depressed, particularly based on like little subtle things around you. Getting to sensory overload. So quickly having just overload of things. Earlier, you had mentioned that idea of how emotions impact things like going to like PT or OT or any of that. But also the flip side of, as you do things like, a heavy day of physical therapy or any therapies, or, whether it be somebody might be working or a family event or things like that, that can really cause overstimulation that then leads to that inability to regulate emotions. the threshold for people, it can shift and change on that. So, your threshold for tolerance might be really large if you had a good night's sleep the night before. But if you had a bad night's sleep and then you might have woken up a little grumpy. And so now your threshold tolerance is really, really low.
Yeah. Or if something knocks off your routine. I know that was a big one for me. It's taken me time to learn how to handle that. But I remember when I was in high school after my TBI, if we would ever have a substitute teacher, I could not handle it. I would cry. I would have to go to the nurse's office because my routine of what we would normally do in class got messed up. And the substitute teacher didn't know about my brain injury and they didn't understand. And my safety net of the teacher that knew me and understood me was not there. So I remember going in the hallway and just crying. And I'd go to the nurse's office all the time. They always would allow me to come and if I needed to calm down. So I would spend a lot of time in there just sitting on one of the beds, just, calming down my nervous system, which I didn't know at the time. That's what it was. But yeah, any little thing that can knock off your routine, even recently, I will have trouble if I have a plan for the day or if I am in the middle of, let's say I made myself an egg for breakfast and I'm going to do the dishwasher before I do something else. And I'm trying to do that. If somebody comes in and asks me to, do you mind taking this to the garage to the recycling? Or, if something interrupts an activity that I'm doing, I have trouble regulating that. And if I'm really tired, like you said, I can get irritable and I can snap at them they don't mean any harm, but I'm so hyper focused on a task that if I get interrupted, it can be hard for me even still to regulate my emotional response.
And I think that's a really good example there because there are things that we give, brain injury survivors for tools for dealing with symptoms. So having a routine, as you said, having a structure, doing things in sequential order and really setting that up. But then, as you said, the real world doesn't necessarily operate that way. So it's really great for us to say to individuals with brain injury, have a process, have a structure, But then your example of somebody coming in and interrupting that, it really can throw you off. So that having a structure is a great, tool for how to deal with things like memory and processing and motivation. But a side effect of that can be that, that dealing with transitions or interruptions and those pieces. And then anytime you have that disruption, it can lead to kind of that emotional piece. A cognitive behavioral spiral where anytime you have something you're trying to do cognitively and then it doesn't go the way you want it to, you get a little bit more frustrated. And as that keeps going, and then eventually you have this outburst and it's the outburst appears like it came out of nowhere, but really it was these slow little things that built up.
That's a really good point. All the little things that build up. Yeah. Even if someone means well, it's not even always your routine's interrupted for a bad reason. Or,
right.
I find if I'm hyper focusing on a task, I was in grad school this last year. So I'd be sitting on my computer, writing a paper, working, reading, just in that mode of trying to get it done. And my sister might come into my room and say, hey, tomorrow, do you want to do this with me? And with the nicest, sweetest intention of wanting to spend time with me tomorrow. But I can't cognitively step out of the task I'm doing to think about tomorrow's schedule to answer her appropriately. And so there's been times that I would snap at my sister or I would say, I'll come in 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes. And then an hour, 2 hours pass. Like you said earlier, not knowing when to stop an activity. And so it's not always even something that is social media or binge watching TV, but even something productive that you're wanting to do. Then you wear your brain out so heavily and then you end up snapping at other people.
Through your darkest night, hope survives.